Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I became aware of an issue, Gracieneros First Nation in Northern Ontario, that has an incredibly terrible disaster that it's been facing for 50 or 60 years because of a pulp and paper plant that had released some chemical, mercury, I think it was, and has led to mercury poisoning of all the residents of this downriver First Nation community. And it is probably an example of the worst treatment that we Canadians have provided to our First Nation brothers. And so I wanted to learn more about it. And we're joined tonight by Alex Vezina, who is the CEO of Prepared Canada. He's an emergency preparedness expert, and he knows about emergencies. And we've talked to him on several occasions about COVID-19. But tonight we're going to be talking about this issue. Alex, tell us a little bit about what the issue is as background so people can understand it, please.
Yeah, this is a very, very big issue that has been going on with root causes potentially for more than 100 years because of how land transfer was done between the Canadian government and previously the British Crown and the First Nations. So I'm not going to get into all that detail because it is quite lengthy. And also, this is more if people are curious about what kind of hats being worn here and where this goes down. This is the disaster risk reduction piece, less so emergency management for those who are familiar with this. Okay, into the case specifically, I'm going to focus on the disaster within the time of the immediate impact of mercury poisoning. Late 1960s, early 1970s, a pulp and paper chemical plant, so a chemical plant that is part of the process of the pulp and paper industry, sets up upstream on a river in Northern Ontario. I'm giving the very brief summary here.
Yep, this is good.
So that process ends up expelling methyl mercury in two ways. It expels it into the air and it expels it into the river system. It's about half and half ballpark. The exact numbers are known now. They can be verified. The point is about 20 metric tons of methyl mercury is put in the river system. The methyl mercury travels downstream. Now, it travels downstream into a community, which happens to be a First Nations community. First Nations communities don't all eat the same thing. Some prefer to eat fish, some prefer to eat other animals. It depends, but they have a preferred food and it's different for each one of them. And they tend to live off the land or live off of the area that they habitate. They are symbiotic with nature in many ways that the Western world isn't as familiar with, fundamentally culturally. So this is very significant. The river itself became essentially poisoned. The water became essentially undrinkable, and the fish became highly toxic with methyl mercury. In Canada, when I was young, my parents taught me about how you have to be careful about how much fish you eat because the fish can be contaminated with heavy metals. This is one of the biggest reasons why that is instilled in many people in Canada when they're young. So what came from this, essentially the water in the fish became undrinkable and uneatable respectively without having serious negative consequences. The First Nation at hand, which is the more easily pronounceable name because there is the actual Ojibwe name for it, and then there is the in Ojibwe pronunciation. In the standard English term, it's referred to as the Gracieneros First Nation. This First Nation noticed that the fish were behaving weirdly because the fish were being odd. And when I get into what mercury poisoning does, you'll see why, and said to people, this seems to be a problem. The government essentially, I'm simplifying here, but ignored it for several years until a Japanese doctor came over, saw what was happening and said that this was a huge problem. Things happened, and eventually the government banned fishing in the area. This keeps going. So this is the summary, because this is just so you know, I know it's long, but this is the summary. This is a fishing and tourism community because it's in Northern Ontario, and you just banned fishing. So now You have people with methylmercury or mercury poisoning that have no economy because they can't fish, and you just said the river is poisonous because it is. So now there's no money coming in. So we have a health problem, and now we have an economic problem stacking on top of it. This ends up persisting for years, and there's a whole bunch of other parts that go into this, but this persists for years. And just for a rough update, as of 2011, there is more research done that finds that there is still 90% plus of the community that has noticeable methylmercury or mercury toxicity symptoms. That this is years later, and the science on this has basically concluded that it's going to be another 50 years before the mercury is out of the water system. In 2020,
50 years before the
from 2011. So it's a 100-year problem. That's the rough estimate. Okay, now there's more. In 2020, the government finally basically did something about it. Prior to that, they did things on regulations because they stopped the company from dumping, essentially. But in 2020, two things occurred. The first, the government put in a $20 million clinic for assisting with mercury-based toxicity and poisoning conditions. So problem as of 1970 gets a clinic in 2020. Just want to keep you on the timeline here. Okay, that's the first thing. Sorry?
50 years late.
Yeah, just so you get the point. This isn't like Walkerton. Okay, this is a First Nations reserve, so they don't get Walkerton treatment. We'll get into that in a bit later. But so 50 years later, and the second thing that happened was they finished a project that was started in 2013 of there was a boil water advisory issued because of a well water issue. The infrastructure was put in place and it was essentially completed. So the boil water advisory that started in 2013 could be lifted in 2020. So in 2020, those two things happened. One more thing, because I got to backtrack this because I still haven't told you what happens when you get too much methylmercury in you.
Okay. We're going to take a break and you can explain that to us after a message. Yep. This is enough information for right now, Alex Vezina. Yep. We're talking about, what's it called again? The Gracieneros?
Gracieneros.
Gracieneros, First Nations community in Northern Ontario that for 50 years has dealt with mercury poisoning from a pulp and paper plant. We're going to take a break and come back more with Alex Vezina in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, 2nd and 60. A challenging conversation tonight with Alex Vezina, the CEO of Prepared Canada, about the Gracieneros First Nations community in Northern Ontario that was subject to 50 years of poisoning from an upstream pulp and paper plant that was releasing, what was it releasing? Mercury what?
Methylmercury.
Methylmercury.
Mercury chemical derivative of.
Okay, and you were going to tell us what this does to us or to them, and I cut you off. I apologize. But before we do that, is this a byproduct that could have? I presume this is a byproduct of the pulp and paper processing manufacturing system. Could they have dealt with it? Could they have captured it? Did it have to be released?
Actually, environmental regulations at the time essentially stated that what was happening was okay. So they ended up changing the regulations, and then the process changed. But the pulp and paper industry, even to this day in certain regions, has some fairly unsafe chemicals that are byproducts of their process that they've changed, but the pulp and paper is difficult to make in a very, very, very safe way, depending on the company, right? This is a company by company issue and a process by process issue, and it gets a bit complicated. But the point is, at the time, it was actually, according to Environment Canada regulations, completely acceptable. And then eventually, years later, it was an oops. And the environment minister at the time and the health minister at the time actually had to backtrack, and there was a whole, it's not a problem, then it is a problem. It was a huge issue, huge issue. Okay,
so tell us what happens if one consumes fish or water with this substance in it.
Okay, so when you consume a lot of methylmercury, keep in mind this is the short version, not from a medical doctor that specializes in this. to really understand what happens, you actually have to go back a bit further in time from what happened and go to Minamata, Japan. The reason for this is because there was a chemical plant in Japan, in Minamata, that was releasing mercury into the water. And they found out in the 50s, and this is before the internet, so information wasn't shared as quickly, right? They found it in the 50s that when you ingest a lot of mercury, bad things happen. And it was known as Minamata disease, high levels of mercury toxicity, because of the first case of this. And the Japanese actually figured this out. This is why it's significant that a Japanese doctor came over and discovered it in Ontario, just so you get kind of the link there.
Gotcha.
So Minamata disease and high levels of mercury toxicity, it's largely neurological in nature. So you have tingling sensations, lack of motor function, lack of ability to do voluntary things. So it'll be difficult to raise your arm, to grip something. You won't, involuntary things like breathing won't necessarily be compromised. But for example, one person in Gracieneros that has fairly severe cases of mercury toxicity has to actually hold their jaw in order to speak, because their jaw, the muscles in their jaw are basically gone. So they have to actually hold up their jaw in order to speak. Just the where it hits and where the toxicity builds up is different, but those are the mild symptoms. The more severe symptom, and there's a few more, but essentially it's neurological damage caused in a whole bunch of ways. The more severe symptoms are coma, insanity, and death. So have you ever heard the term mad as a hatter before?
No.
Okay, so mad as a hatter, an old English term, actually comes from the idea that people who would work on felt hats worked with a lot of mercury, and it would drive them insane. So the phrase mad as a hatter comes from mercury toxicity. We've known about mercury for over 1,000 years. Like we've known that it does stuff, and we've known that there's a link to things like insanity.
Mad Hatter and Alice in Wonderland?
Yes, there's a direct correlation. That's actually where that comes from. Okay. It's mercury poisoning.
Unbelievable. So it's something we've known for a long period of time. This pulp and paper plant was releasing it. Were they told? Were there, like, did they know that they were causing this problem and they just kept on doing it because it was supposedly allowed?
I don't want to get myself into legal trouble here. Possibly you can look that up yourselves on the internet if you're curious, to be honest. The reality is that it was acceptable under environmental regulations at the time, and they are a business. Okay. And if the government says it is acceptable, then it is acceptable. How long did this
go on before the regulation changed?
About half a decade, a bit more actually. I have to check the dates again, but it wasn't a short period of time.
And was only Gracieneros impacted, or more communities downstream?
In this specific case, they were the worst impacted, but there have been other First Nations where other things have happened that are similar.
This river, what's the name of the river and where does it flow to?
I want to actually pull it up for you for the exact names, just to make sure that is all good, because I want to make sure that I get the exact names right for you. So if you don't mind.
And you say Northern Ontario, so this is like north of Thunder Bay?
I think I believe it's to the west of Thunder Bay.
So almost.
I want to give you the exact name.
Northwest of Thunder Bay towards Manitoba, or northern Manitoba.
Yes.
But Ontario goes up, as a lot of us don't realize, goes up a long way. Goes a long way west and a long way north.
Yes, it does. It definitely does. I had it here. Oh, yeah. Sorry, the English Wabigoon River, specifically. And this is northern Kenora in Ontario, but the plant is north of that. So this is all.
And does the river flow into Lake Superior or into Hudson's Bay?
I have to look at the map again. To be honest, I have to look at the map again. But okay. This is honestly, me describing it is not as significant as just Googling it and looking at a picture. Because if you look at a picture, it's really clear, just for the exact orientation. And we are talking about a community of less than 3,000 people.
Yeah.
But it's still, the level of damage here is just astronomical.
Yeah.
Like, it's disproportionate to a degree, which I don't think people really appreciate. Like when we talk about people being poisoned by a river to this degree, you wouldn't expect it in Canada.
No.
Right. So if you want, what I could do is I could get a picture and then bring it up and put it behind me if you'd like, but it's going to take me some time to do that.
No,
So
let's not worry about it. So tell me what's happened since.
Okay, so the main thing that's happened since, there's been quite a few things, but the two main things in 2020 are the more major positive directions. There has been the clinic that the $20 million clinic that the government came to an agreement with the people of Gracieneros on to put in for the mercury toxicity. That's the first thing. And the second thing was the infrastructure improvement that helped lift the boil water advisory. However, in 2019, the government, federal government, got into some trouble over this. And this was fairly big news at the time. The prime minister was holding a political event, and a Gracieneros protester showed up and interrupted the political event by bringing light to what's happening here. And the prime minister told them thanks for the donation and shooed them away. It was one of the only times the prime minister was that cold to a vulnerable population that was in front of him. And he had to apologize pretty aggressively, pretty seriously after that. So it was relatively big news, which is another reason why I'm surprised so few people still know about this. It's right. It's been one of the most biggest embarrassments politically of the current prime minister, and it still isn't well known. You
were saying, government didn't do what it needed to do. Which government are we talking about? Provincial, federal, both?
Yeah, well, both. And so, I mean, it's more so a federal issue because we're dealing with First Nations. So generally speaking, that ends up being federal. But still both, right? You have people who are dying from the water who live in Canada. Something can be done. And I know that sounds idealistic, but the degree to which this harm is kind of necessitates something, right? It's one thing if we're debating, a funding package for some people's wants for the next 20 years. It's another thing if people are actively dying and their nervous system is failing because environmental regulations failed to stop a company from dumping mercury into their drinking water and their main food supply. And actually, that's another angle of this that I think we should get into. The significance of fish to this community, I don't think people really understand, and how unique that can be to some First Nations. So if you want me to just go off on that.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Okay.
So fish to the Gracieneros community, and specifically walleye, yellow pike or yellow pickerel, I wouldn't say it's sacred, but it almost is. It is the delicacy. It's like turkey at Thanksgiving, but more. It is their staple. It is their cultural staple. It is their dietary staple. They are a people that view the river and view the water as the giver of health and bounty and etc. And the idea that is toxic is culturally shattering. So you have an economic issue from the shutting down of businesses for health reasons. You have the health issue, and now you have a complete, frankly, cultural upheaval. Like it's a huge problem. You can't just send them poultry.
Yeah.
Because they don't live off of poultry.
Well, right? I understand that the very first thing that the Ontario government did was to tell them to stop eating fish. And fish was, as you said, the main source of protein for them. And then to close down the fishing business. And the unemployment rate was 90%.
They're a fishing and tourism industry, town or community. That's basically all they do. Right. And if the river's toxic, they can't fish in it. Many of the people who worked in the fishing industry, the fishing guides, even after the fishing was banned, and when the mercury levels went down, the mercury levels in the river system are low enough today where most doctors will say that it's okay for you or I or someone who doesn't live in the area to go there and eat the fish. But for people who live there, who have the history of eating it, it's potentially life-threatening because they already have too much in their system. But if you're going to fish in this community and the guide won't eat the fish, you're not going to want to eat the fish. So if I'm the guide and I want to make sure that I give you a good experience and I need my job, I'm going to eat the fish. Right?
Right.
Because otherwise you won't eat the fish and you're going to have a bad experience and you won't come back and I won't make any money.
So even after the closure of the plant, the cleanup that has occurred, today the fish contain 13 to 15 times the recommended levels of mercury.
That sounds about right. The date that could be a few years old, but it's still virtually all estimates that I've seen say it's going to be 50 years until it's something that's remotely acceptable. That's what the science is saying.
And as you said that people have experienced hypertension, stroke, lung, stomach, psychiatric, orthopedic, and heart diseases.
Yeah, generally speaking, it's neurological problems, so something in the nervous system and or brain with a whole bunch of other issues. But you see the muscular failure causing some sort of issue neurologically most commonly, and or insanity, coma, and death.
How come we've not heard about this?
Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons and many different rabbit holes we can dive down on that one. But how many Indigenous stories have you heard of? Did you know about the residential school system before it was made blatantly public in recent history?
Certainly heard rumors of it, but didn't know a lot about it and have been shocked with what we've learned.
Well, why not? I mean, I knew about that for decades.
So you're saying
I was taught it in school, actually.
Media aren't paying appropriate attention to issues that are affecting our First Nations.
Well, maybe not, but why do the media pay attention to things? What dictates what the media, how does the media choose where it's going to go?
What people are interested in hearing about it.
Okay, well, are people interested in hearing about why First Nations people are dying or them dying in the past? Previous to this year, were they interested?
So you're saying there was just people weren't interested?
Well, what dictates how the media moves? You only have so many things in your life that you can focus on. And I mean, this is going to get pretty dark pretty fast, but I mean, we're talking, so it was going to go here anyways. So like you only have so many things that you focus on, right? So people have limited attention, and how many people want to go find out about this stuff? Really? How many people are just trying to get through their day-to-day, make sure their kids are happy, their family is fed, and that nothing is going to imminently risk their safety or security in the next few months? Really? I think that's the majority of the population. The majority of the population wants just everyone to be happy and safe and their family to be okay. And other than that, this doesn't necessarily matter to them unless it's made apparent. So why would there be a lot of political will? I mean, it's the other some less than 3,000 people in Northern Ontario. Why do you care? Like, I care because human rights. I care because it's my industry, right? But like, you know what I'm saying? Like what?
Well, yeah, but we've talked about in the last couple of months about cultural genocide in regards to residential schools. And when you think about what you're talking about here, a pulp and paper plant had lax environmental rules, poisoned since 1970 until 2000, and the boiled water, only came into effect in 2013. Sorry, yeah, 2013. So from 1970 until 2013, 43 years, they were pumping mercury into the system.
No. The mercury pumping wasn't happening for 43 years. The mercury pumping happened for less than a decade, but the effect was that it destroyed the river for that long.
Okay, and
it seeped into the groundwater and everything else, right?
And we had these lax rules. We obviously must have seen some issues.
Yep.
We number one, tell people to stop drinking the water. We number two, tell them to stop eating the fish, which is 90% of what they eat. We then tell them to stop fishing and tourism and create unemployment of 90%.
So here's
That
another
sounds like
interesting
cultural genocide.
No, it sounds more like non-cultural genocide. It sounds like regular old normal genocide. And actually, it was described that way in the 70s by the CBC.
In the 70s.
In the 70s, the CBC, journalist for the CBC, I believe, or at least was featured on the CBC, called it genocide, or that it is tantamount to genocide. And that's in the CB archives. You can go look at it today. Right? We've seen this. And, you know, further, just to kind of dovetail off that point, you know, we told them that it was bad, that they shouldn't eat the fish, correct?
Yep.
Except in 2011, when the CBC went back and re-interviewed them, there were several people that had no idea that the walleye, their particular favorite fish, in particular was bad for them. When asked, including the, I believe it was one of the relatives of one of the chiefs or former chiefs at the time, when asked if they were aware that the walleye was particularly dangerous to eat when she was pregnant, she said, "No one ever told me that." So,
and yet the statistic is that it's, while 17 times the normal level of mercury in the fish for everybody, it's 40 times the amount of mercury one needs or should have for a pregnant person.
Yes. And in particular, the walleye is the statistical outlier as the fish that has the most mercury in it relative to all the other fish. And it's their favorite fish.
Walleye, by the way, I think is just pickerel, or another name for pickerel.
Yeah, pickerel or pike. Yeah. So just to reconfirm that. But, you know, so there has been a medical or health risk communication issue. It's like when you have any medical procedure, beyond medical procedure, any sort of risk reduction, this is getting to the emergency management side, any sort of risk reduction measure that you want to inform the public on. It is critical that it get delivered to them successfully, one, and that it get communicated to them in a way where they are likely to act on it too. If you want people to do something to be safer or to be healthier or etc., and they don't hear the message, and they don't act on it in a way where they actually do the message, it's useless. The message is pointless. What you want to do is irrelevant because they're not doing it. It's like asking people to drink water and exercise, and then they don't drink water and exercise. Your treatment doesn't work because people don't do it. Same thing here. If you're telling them not to eat the fish, but they don't receive the message, your treatment of not eating the fish doesn't work because they kept eating the fish. Like, this should be obvious to people, but unfortunately it's not. And I have talked to you about this previously on the medical side, but about how we do not focus on the importance of communication of risk reduction measures in our emergency services and in the fields where we provide these things. For example, we don't put enough focus, I would argue, on communication to the patient in medicine. You following what I'm saying there?
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. We're chatting tonight with Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada, about Gracieneros, a First Nations community that was poisoned with mercury, and it's devastated the community. Stay with us. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Alex in just a minute. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada, who's an emergency preparedness expert, but he also has studied some disasters and what has been called the worst environmental disaster in Canadian history. The Gracieneros First Nations community in Northern Ontario was contaminated, poisoned with mercury from an upstream pulp and paper plant. Alex, a couple of facts that I think are kind of interesting is that the Gracieneros First Nation wasn't first at that river. They were actually at the Lake of Woods, and the Canadian government negotiated with the tribe to move them effectively from the Lake of Woods to the river, the Wagiban English River system, so that they could have a place where they could hunt, fish, trap, etc. And they were only moved there in 1963.
I believe that was the government of Manitoba, right?
Federal government relocated the Grassy.
No, but I think there was also some exchange of the river system and some, with that First Nation in particular in Manitoba in the 1920s. There was quite some history here. There's a lot that's actually gone on. I need to read up on it again to give you a better background on it, because my focus tends to be on
the disaster.
Disaster.
It's interesting, right? Because often disasters happen because of bad planning. And until the 1940s, supposedly the tribe was completely self-supporting in their previous land, where they in their natural lands, they hunted, they fished, and they were completely self-supporting. And then in our wisdom, the Canadian government decided to move them from their historical lands into this new reserve, and moved them there in 1963. And then between 1962 and 1970, so 8 years, Dryden Chemicals Limited, a subsidiary of the British multinational Reed International, discharged approximately 10 tons of mercury into the Wabigon River. 100 kilometers.
That's not in metric. I believe my most recent number on that I heard was metric tons, not tons. But I mean, either way, it's a lot.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
And it was 100 kilometers upstream of Gracieneros, but it poisoned the fish. And it wasn't until 1975 that your Japanese doctor came along and said that at that time that there were more than 3 times the Health Canada limit of mercury in the blood, 7 times in some areas, and then came back and tested again in 2004, and found that every single person that he had tested in 1975 was dead. Yep,
that sounds about right.
In response to that,
yeah, that sounds about right.
Leo Bernier, who was the Ontario Minister of Natural Resources, said on CBC, as it happens, no real danger to the First Nations.
Yep. I mean, but look, let's go back a bit. 1975, the Health Minister of Ontario at the time would later become Premier of Ontario for 4 months. 90% sure. I'm right on that. Health Minister of Ontario basically received the file and sent a bunch of doctors from Canada over to Japan to learn about Minamata disease. And the press gave him grief for it and said, is this not just grandstanding? Or are you not just, making a symbol? And the response from the health minister was, no, our doctors don't understand how to identify mercury well enough. I'm paraphrasing here, that they don't understand how to identify mercury poisoning well enough. And we need to go get them trained by the people who know how to do this. So there is a disconnect in understanding, one, mercury and mercury poisoning in Canada at that time, and two, understanding the importance of sharing expertise from multiple countries by the people who represent the questions asked by the public. Like the fact that question was asked and how confrontational it was at the time, to me, speaks to the lack of understanding of how severe the problem was in medicine in Canada.
And then in 1984, the environment minister at the time declared that there was no need for government intervention because the river was cleaning itself, quote unquote. And in 85, the province of Ontario granted the company an immunity, a broad indemnity, assuming all environmental liabilities related to the mill and its mercury dumping, when the local company was bought by a British company.
Yeah. And in 2019, the acting prime minister was blindsided by this and didn't know how much of a political quicksand issue it was, and put his foot in his mouth and said, thanks for your donation. And The issue there, and this is a really important point. The issue there is not whether or not a politician was tired and said something that wasn't a very good idea. The point is that the prime minister at the time that represented the government that essentially ran on reconciliation and was in place since 2015 wasn't briefed enough to know it was political quicksand. The fact that gaffe was possible speaks to how well this issue is not understood. If the prime minister was briefed on how big this issue was, wouldn't have happened. There's no way.
It almost seems so often when we find out about these things that there's been cover-ups. I got to tell you about something else. In 2016, a confidential report by an environmental consulting firm commissioned by Domtar, who have now owned and operated the pulp and paper mill since 2007, revealed that Ontario provincial authorities knew decades ago that the site of the mill was contaminated with mercury. The report included archival reports from the mill, which showed that groundwater samples collected by the company over many years had, quote, extremely high mercury levels, end quote. In 2016, the Ontario Ministry of the Environment said that there was no need for remediation other than natural sedimentation. And a gentleman by the name of Kaz Glawak, who had since collaborated on research regarding the mercury poisoning, reported that when he worked in the mill in the 1970s, he had been part of a group who haphazardly dumped drums filled with salt and mercury into a pit behind the mill. You know, the government appears to have covered it up. The company appears to have known about what was the high levels of mercury and covered it up. And the people involved were haphazardly dumping drums of mercury into pits.
Yep. But also, right, like this, as I said, I gave you the summary, which was still pretty long because this keeps going. Also, back to the 2019 thing, when the CBC interviewed members of Gracieneros First Nations, the way the interview transpired says to me the lack of understanding of this issue in general from members of the media who traditionally have been trying to shine a light on it even. Like the degree to which we do not understand this issue as a people is significant to state the least. So, for example, talking to one of the people who's lived through this, the questions are asked, so are you looking for an apology? No, we're looking for, paraphrasing what the person replied with, no, we're looking for action. Now, the person doesn't say what I'm about to say, but basically, they don't want an apology. They want to not die from the water. Pretty simple. The CBC retorts with, so are you looking for an in-person apology? The fact that a professional trained journalist can miss the point on something this blatantly obvious speaks to how well we don't understand it. And I think that people really need to just clue in on that. like this is almost, from my perspective, it's almost unbelievable. Not really, but you're seeing this in detail for really this amount of detail for the first time right now, and it's apparent, right?
Yep. And then to add insult to injury, I understand what happened next is we granted logging rights such that the local lumber companies could clear cut the environment, and the community took the company to court and lost in court because the court said that the Canadian government had the rights on lumbering and could grant it to companies, and the local Native communities had no right to object. And then the clear cutting was found from many environmentalists to be an environmental disaster. The impact of clear cutting and freedom of information request revealed several concerns by biologists that were never followed up on. And so it happened all over again.
So here's my big thing from how this affects my work, to be honest. In order for me to create an action plan or a strategy on best how to assist with a disaster, I have to understand the context that I'm working within. And frankly, I need to know whether or not First Nations people are lesser than in Canada. Not treated as lesser than, are lesser than. Because right now, I am hearing, and I personally would agree with, the idea that they are not lesser than, but pretty difficult to create an action plan and come up with something that will be approved to make it so less people die or have long-term medical problems or long-term hardship, when it is fairly evident that they are at minimum treated as lesser than, if not unspoken of, basically are in the Canadian context. And that is a problem because it directly affects the ability for people who want to help to help. Like, it's crazy. And I shouldn't use that word, but like, it's like, can we decide on if First Nations are lesser than and be consistent? And is that a question that needs to be asked when the government is like, why is this question even necessary when we have a government that is the beacon of reconciliation? Like what?
It's amazing that, as we've talked about environmental degradation, as we've talked about residential schools, that these cover-ups could continue for such a long period of time, and that the lack of attention to solving the problem, and that people still have mercury poisoning and drinking boiled water advisories. It's amazing. And the language that was used to describe what was going on, that I found, Alex, was environmental racism.
Yeah, okay. I'm good with that. I mean, I would have gone with environmental racism causing genocide as per the CBC, but sure. I mean, yeah. But I mean, you could mix those together. Yeah.
We're chatting with Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada, about what happened at Gracieneros community in Northern Ontario, where 90% of the population have gotten mercury poisoning. Everyone tested in the 1970s, when retested in the 2013 era, was no longer around, had died from mercury poisoning. It caused a whole bunch of different things. Hypertension, stroke, neurological problems, etc. And it appears that even though the government has tried to do some things about it, we haven't done nearly enough. We took away their source of protein. We took away their source of employment. We took away their culture. We took away their drinking water, and it would appear we haven't substituted much. And then we took away their timber, took away their forest, took away their wood. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute with Alex Vezina. Stay with us. Welcome back to a really bothersome interview that we're having tonight with Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada. Bothersome because what's coming to my light, because I didn't know about it before, and maybe that's my mistake, even though I think pride myself on being reasonably well read, is a disaster, an environmental and economic, social, cultural disaster in Northern Ontario, called the Gracieneros First Nation, that was poisoned with mercury from an upstream, 100-kilometer upstream pulp and paper plant that was only operational, Alex, for 14 years. Only operational for 14 years, but it produced so much mercury, and it turns out that the plant had tests at the time, according to people that worked there, and archival information that showed that they knew that they were releasing high levels of mercury into the water. Employees that talked later on about them dumping barrels of mercury and salt into pits behind the plant. And then we come along and we tell people to not drink the water, eat the fish. Fish, 90% of them become unemployed, and then they end up having a whole slew of health issues. You're a disaster emergency preparedness expert. What are the lessons learned here? Are there any?
Oh, there's several. There are many, many lessons that we can learn from this. First, disasters are all have root causes and are all a confluence of multiple things happening bad that happen at the same time. So you've heard before with COVID and with other things about the perfect storm problem. We really don't appreciate perfect storms. And the way you prevent a perfect storm is by stopping the individual things from coming together, reducing the chance that perfect storm occurs. So environmental regulations are one of them. Listening to people when they comment that something is abnormal is another. There's little things that all have to line up for something like this to really occur and to have it happen at the scale that it has. So that's the first thing that we can learn. Learning how to identify that better and how to prevent the perfect storm. Number one. Number two, risk communication. And frankly, actually new number two, risk in general. People do not have a very good understanding of risk. And because of it, it is very difficult to communicate risk. Many experts who communicate risks don't actually understand risk. For example, many people think that they will win the lottery, but they will never be involved in a car accident. They overestimate positive risks that are unlikely, and they underestimate negative risks that are unlikely. That's number two. Number three, the communication piece. We saw it with COVID. We've seen it with other things. If you cannot successfully communicate the message and get the behavior that you're looking for, the communication needs improvement. And we haven't learned well enough how to do it. It's obvious to, I think, virtually everyone. Have you not also, stated numerous times over the pandemic, as virtually everyone in the media has, that there are significant issues with the way things have been communicated? Brian, have you not?
It's incredible. There's no question.
That's number three. And there are a few others. But really, I think what people need to get an appreciation for coming out of this, which is a lesson that is, I guess, yet to be learned, is that there is a certain bar that we should exceed on basic human rights, on, basic survival, that I think everyone within our general borders is probably entitled to or ought to be entitled to. That's my opinion. My field's very based on vulnerability studies, but fair enough. But the people shouldn't be dying from their food and their water. But we apparently don't know that. And there's a lesson to be learned there.
There sure is. This is a tragedy, and another one that we need to be mindful of, and another one impacting our First Nations community. And last year was clearly the year of COVID, and Black Lives Matter came upon us because of what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis, and we paid attention like probably we haven't since Martin Luther King to the issue of anti-Black racism. And what's happened this past 2 months with the discovery of unmarked graves at residential schools, I think has probably brought to our attention the issues associated with our relationship with our First Nations, with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, like no other. And so therefore, issues like this, Gracieneros, environmental racism, if not, as you described it, environmental genocide, cultural genocide, are things that we need to educate ourselves about and become aware of, because it's regrettably part of our history. And And who was it that said, if we don't understand history, we're bound to repeat it? And we need to understand that history and not just apologize, obviously, as you well pointed out, but to make it right.
First Nations around the country have repeatedly said, we're not looking for an apology, we're looking for action.
We're not looking for an apology, we're looking for action. Great words. Alex Vezina, CEO Prepared Canada, thanks for bringing this issue to our attention. Good night, everybody.
Good night.